Us of your map background.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, thanks for being here. I have a special guest with me today. His name is Scott Ritter. You may know Scott. He's a former UN weapons inspector. He's also a former Marine intelligence officer. And Scott, you can correct me if I'm wrong here, but 20 years ago, you were a real sought after commentator on certain television channels, if I recall, whereas today it's mostly independent media that wants to hear from you. And I'm wondering if that is true or not, because I remember in the run up to the Iraq war, you were somebody who was really in demand as a commentator. People wanted to get your perspective. And because I remember there were like two prevailing ways that you could go. You could say, should we do this? And here are the reasons we should do it, or maybe we shouldn't do this, and maybe here's Scott Ritter to explain to the audience why it might not be a good idea. And I'm wondering if you recall those times, obviously, and what's changed in the last 20 years.
Well, I definitely recall that. Let's even go before that. Up until 1998, it was my goal not to be known by anybody outside the immediate circles of the U.S. government. It's not an intelligence officer's job to have notoriety.
Right.
And I successfully avoided that. Not perfectly. When I was a weapons inspector in the former Soviet Union, given the historical nature of the task, I and the other inspectors had been interviewed by the media. So there were a number of newspaper articles and such where my name was present. But then I, went back to the Marine Corps. I fought the war in the Gulf War with zero media attention. Thank goodness. And then I joined the United Nations weapons inspectors, and the nature of that job was very sensitive. I was tasked with creating a intelligence unit for the United Nations, and then gathering intelligence, assessing intelligence, and then using that intelligence to carry out what we called no-notice inspections, which means they can't be no notice. Everybody knows about them, and so it was imperative that we kept very, very closely held how we did things, and equally as important, who was doing these things. That's why early on I was primarily appointed as the deputy of a chief inspector, primarily a Russian named Nikita Smitovich, very smart man. He took all the press heat. He did the press interviews. He's the face that the world saw, and I was the Wizard of Oz behind the screen making things happen. And I was very happy with that. That until near the end, Nikita, because of politics, stepped aside, and I was compelled to step forward, and suddenly the media learned my name. The Iraqis put my name out there in very controversial thing, calling me a CIA agent, and they promoted me to the rank of colonel. Thank you. Some even called me a general. I was appreciative of that. But long story short, then I resigned, and my resignation became very public. I testified before the Senate, and my name, for better or for worse, had a household quality attached to it, especially after Joe Biden singled me out during the Senate hearings and called me Scotty Boy, and indicated that I was involved in things that were above my pay grade, et cetera. And because of that notoriety, I was, I guess, an attractive source for mainstream media to use, up until the point when it became clear that I wasn't going to play the politics that they wanted me to play. I was about the business of telling the truth about weapons inspections. People were either in the business of bashing Bill Clinton or later on promoting George W. Bush. I'm in neither of those camps. So there was a period of time, I'd say from 1999 through say 2001, where my presence wasn't welcome on most mainstream media. But after 9/11, and as Iraq was once again thrust into the mainstream, I became very much involved. And part of that was because I opted to.
Mhm.
The wonderful thing about being in my position is when the phone rings from a producer, I don't have to say yes. And many times I would just say no. I'm not interested in that.
Right.
But after 9/11, when it became clear that we were headed towards a war with Iraq, I had to make the choice. What was I going to do about it? Because this was a war that was defined by weapons of mass destruction, and the perception that Iraq continued to produce them, continued to retain them, and therefore posed a threat worthy of war because of these weapons. And I knew that this was false, not suspected, not believed, not maybe. I knew dead out, flat out, because of my 7 years worth of experience being the guy responsible for investigating this very issue. There was no debate here.
Right.
And so, do I live a quiet life, get up in the morning, mind my own business, and go to bed at night and try to sleep well, knowing that Marines that I used to lead, used to work with, were getting prepared to go fight and perhaps die in a war that should not be fought? Or do I step out, which is against my nature, and um, and bring this issue to the forefront in the hope that the American people, once empowered with the knowledge that we were getting ready to go to war on a lie, could do something about it. So I opted for the latter, and I spoke out,
Yeah.
and I did so in a manner that I could not be ignored. I mean, it's one thing to be a talking head at home waiting for a producer to call you. It's another to get on an airplane, fly to Iraq, and meet with the Iraqi parliament for the purpose of trying to convince the Iraqis to let weapons inspectors back in, being the only foreigner ever to address the Iraqi parliament in session. And then to knock on the door of every senior Iraqi official other than Saddam Hussein and have face-to-face meetings with them, insisting that they allow inspectors back in, to bankrupt myself making a documentary movie about this issue, to write articles after articles, to write op-ed after op-ed, to engage in whatever debate I want. And so, I forced myself onto the stage. And in doing so, I think I set myself up for failure, because, when an individual steps out without the backing of institutions, you're fair game. And starting in early 2003, I was subjected to some very virulent smear campaigns that sought to question my character. And as a result, the phone stopped ringing. And that's just the way it is. So what? I mean, I went back to living my life, and it is what it is.
Yeah. Well, that's a good recap, because you forget about all the things that went on 18, 20 years ago, the way our government really ramped up the war and convinced everybody that this was the only thing that we could do. It kind of reminds me of some of the things that are going on today a little bit, Scott. I wanted obviously to get your perspective on what's currently going on the ground in Ukraine, unfiltered, where this thing is, how much longer this is going to last, and who you think the victor will be.
Well, let me preface that by saying, unlike when I spoke out about weapons of mass destruction, where you literally could take my word and go to the bank with it, because it was not just what I believed to be the truth. It was the truth. It was fact-based, facts that I personally investigated, facts that I personally uncovered, which is one of the reasons why I felt so strongly about speaking out. Today, I'm thousands of miles away from where the action is taking place.
Right.
I haven't been on active service now for coming on 30 years.
Yeah.
So when you say unfiltered, I have to say, I'm sorry, I can't give you unfiltered. I'm going to give you the Ritter filter because
Okay.
that's all I can offer you. I'm somebody who is thousands of miles distance, and I am prisoner to the same data that
Hmm.
everybody else is prisoner to, that which is publicly released. I don't have a special phone that I can call up the Kremlin and get the inside scoop from Vladimir Putin, or call up Zelensky and say, hey, tell me what's really going on the ground.
Yeah.
I don't have friends fighting on the front lines of either side. I've got nothing. I've got exactly what everybody else has, with one exception. I have my personal experiences
Hmm.
as a military officer, and I have a lifetime of doing this very task, receiving fragments of data, trying to discern which ones have more viability than the others, and then use them to piece together a 1,000 piece puzzle with only 52 pieces and tell you what the puzzle's supposed to mean. Um,
Got it.
I did that for a living. I
Yeah.
did a very good job of it. If that was the case, I could have hang on my wall, um, about 6 different 1,000 piece puzzles where I predicted perfectly what it would be with 52 pieces, and predicted to very senior audiences from the President of the United States on down.
Yeah.
So that's another reason why I feel comfortable doing this, because normally on something of this complexity, I would not want to put myself out there, because who am I to interject myself into the mainstream discussion, et cetera? I'm just one of a million different voices. But on this issue, I feel I do have something to offer, not as
Mhm.
the source,
Right.
but as a source, meaning that I feel comfortable being used as a tool by others so that they can better formulate their own opinions. I'm not here to dictate anything to anybody, unlike Iraq, where I was dictating
Yeah.
because there was no way I was wrong, and history proved me so. Today, man, I could be as wrong as the day is long. I mean, who
Yeah.
knows what the heck's going on there? I'm simply providing filtered information, the
Okay.
data that's filtered through the vehicle of Scott Ritter. And I feel comfortable with this data. So now to answer your question, we are 4+ months into a war that I didn't believe was going to last more than a month, which tells you right off the bat, um, you know, we got an issue here,
Right.
because nobody has perfect data. I believed that Russia was going to initiate a military conflict with Ukraine by bringing to bear the totality of its military potential. And I
Mm.
believe that that military potential was going to be sufficiently violent enough to break Ukrainian resistance in rapid order.
Right.
I was wrong. The Russians did not bring to bear the totality of their military potential in a focused effort. They didn't go to war against Ukraine. I thought they were going to go to war against Ukraine.
Hmm.
They instead instituted something called a special military operation,
Right.
which is different from anything that has ever been done in modern military history. I can't think of any situation where combat of this scale has been fought with so many constraints placed on the initiator. Normally, when you initiate offensive military action, you seek to do so where you have, um, the majority of advantages. You wait, for instance, until the moon is gone so that your aircraft can fly across a darkened sky, difficult to see. You wait until the enemy has lowered most of their defenses. You seek to secretly accumulate power, etc. That's not what happened here. The Russians were just straight up. We got 200,000 people on your border. Here they are,
Yeah.
and we're coming in now, but we're not going to blow you away. Uh, we're going to come in and we're going to try and negotiate our way through the villages, the towns, the cities. We're trying to convince the Ukrainian army to stay in the barracks, not to fight, to convince the people to step aside, not resist, because our goals, our objectives are pure. We mean Ukraine no harm. We simply have to get rid of this threat that has manifested itself.
Yeah.
Why did the Russians believe that? I don't know. They haven't come out and formally said so. We have some hints based upon the firing of hundreds of intelligence officers from the FSB, the Russian Federal Security Forces, who are part of the 5th Department or Directorate, which is responsible for what's called the near abroad, those former Soviet states that surround the periphery of present-day Russian Federation.
Mm-hmm.
And the Ukraine, of course, is obviously one of these near abroads. And it appears that they had conducted a very extensive intelligence preparation of the battlefield type operation, where they went in and talked with, bribed, cajoled, blackmailed, whatever term you want to use, a number of Ukrainian military officers and civilian officials, sufficient for the military to believe that they would be able to move rapidly forward without resistance. So the goal of the special military operation was to move in as quickly as possible, get as far into Ukraine as possible in order to confront the Ukrainian government with a fait accompli, meaning Russia's here, there's nothing you can do about it.
Right.
You need to concede to the Russian demands, which were simple. One, you aren't going to join NATO. 2, you're going to get rid of these Nazis. And 3, all the NATO infrastructure that you've incorporated into your military over the past 8 years has got to go. We're going to demilitarize, denazify, and you're going to be neutral.
Right.
Oh, and by the way, Donbass, they're already declared independent, so you're going to have to recognize that.
Right.
That didn't happen.
No.
The Russian military forces, as they moved in, were sucked into traps. Apparently, the people that told the FSB that they would cooperate either were working for the Ukrainian intelligence services, meaning they were double agents, or they just flat out lied, or the FSB made a mistake. I think this will go down in history as one of the greatest intelligence failures in modern times. If this is indeed what happened, it's a huge intelligence failure, a big black mark against the Russians. And it's one that, isn't just an embarrassment. It resulted in the loss of thousands of lives as Russian convoys drove into elaborate traps that were set by the Ukrainian military, ambushes, not just using Javelin missiles, but artillery ambushes, meaning pre-registered fires. As the Russian column moved in, they take out the first vehicle, the last vehicle, and then they would just obliterate the column with artillery that had already been registered on the target. And they destroyed thousands of vehicles. They killed thousands of Russians. It was a slaughter, an absolute slaughter.
Yeah.
But still, then the Russians continued to go in with what's called this special military operation. The goal of the Russians was not to kill Ukrainian soldiers in large numbers. They weren't trying to eliminate the army by slaughtering them. They're trying to get them to surrender. They weren't there to punish the Ukrainian population. They didn't view the Ukrainian population as a hostile population. They weren't trying to destroy Ukrainian infrastructure. But what happened is, because of this failure, this abject failure at the front, the Russians had to shift gears. And shifting gears in combat is a very difficult thing because you're under fire. The enemy is now engaged, and you have to adapt to them. And there was this very difficult period where the Russians were compelled to realign their force structure, realign their objectives, realign how they were doing things. And we'll call this phase 1 of the fight. Phase 1 ended sometime in mid-March. By the time phase 1 ended, the Russians had reshaped the battlefield. Their original shaping was done by the intelligence services. That was a mistake. They had now reshaped the battlefield, meaning that they had successfully engaged Ukrainian military forces, fixed them in location. They had done maneuvering that forced Ukrainians to dissipate their reserves, sending them up to Kiev, down to Odessa, anywhere but to the east. And then they used air power and missiles to degrade Ukrainian command and control, logistics, ammunition, fuel, etc., so that the Ukrainian military was now fixed in a position that was to the advantage of Russia. Remember when I said you want to launch offensive operations when all of the advantages accrue to you? By the end of phase one, the Russians had painfully shaped the battlefield. They suffered egregious losses, but so were the Ukrainians. I mean, the fact is, as many losses as the Russians suffered, the Ukrainians were losing men and equipment at a rate of around 5 to 6 to 1, meaning that for every Russian dead, there were 5 to 6 Ukrainian dead. That's not a sustainable method. But now we move to phase two. Phase two stopped being, even though they called it a special military operation, the gloves came off.
Yeah.
The Russians now have the enemy fixed where they want, and they begin the process of grinding them down. Now, a lot of people thought that phase two would be World War II-like in its maneuver, meaning large arrows on a map, busting through the Ukrainian lines, sweeping around, encircling them like they did with the Germans. Is the Russian army capable of doing this? Yeah. But if you study World War II, even though, for instance, right now is the anniversary of Operation Bagration, one of the greatest military offenses in the history of the world, fought against Army Group Center in Belarus in World War II, where the Soviet Army annihilated a Russian or German army group. And you're like, yay, they beat the Germans, yay, yay, yay. They suffered over 1 million dead.
Yeah.
The Soviets. In winning this great victory, they suffered over 1 million dead. Right. Because great victories don't come without great sacrifice. And Russia, the one thing that didn't change with the special military operation is it didn't become a war, meaning they didn't mobilize. They still were limited to those 200,000 troops, some of which were reinforced, but they never became much greater than that. Russia can't afford to do a World War II type assault. So what they've done instead is they've just decided they are going to grind them down kilometer by kilometer, mile by mile. And it's a more difficult fight because they're fighting on terrain that the Ukrainians have had 8 years to prepare. They've entrenched themselves. They have reinforced concrete bunkers. They have in-depth things. So as the Russians approach, as a tank approaches a line, it can be hit from multiple angles. So the Russians now, before they move a tank in, which is a death trap for the guys in the tank, they have to eliminate all this. How do they do this? Artillery. Yeah. This has become an artillery war. And Russia has the advantage. Today, it's widely accepted, and nobody is contradicting these numbers, so I'm comfortable repeating them, that the Ukrainians are firing between 5,000 to 6,000 rounds of artillery a day. That's a lot. Yeah. But it's not, it's a lot. The Russians are firing 60 to 75,000 artillery rounds a day. Wow. To put that in perspective, during Desert Storm, all of Desert Storm, the United States fired 60,000 artillery rounds for the whole operation. The Russians are exceeding that on a daily basis. Wow. And they're crunching, they're grinding, they're destroying the Ukrainian military, one village, one strong point at a time. They crush it, they drive them back. They crush, they drive back. They're creating small cauldrons where they're surrounding 500, 1,000, 2,000, 3,000 Ukrainian soldiers at a time. And they've come up with a formula that is almost, there are Russian casualties. Let's never forget that the Ukrainian military is very large, very large military, 260,000 active duty troops, nearly 1 million reservists and territorial defense forces, very well equipped, very well led, very well trained, especially those units have been given the benefit of 7 years of NATO training, participating in NATO exercises, having NATO instructors on the ground. The United States prides itself in having trained 5 battalions of Ukrainian forces a year to NATO standards, and then bragging about how they sent them off to fight in the Donbass to kill Russians. So it's a very big army, and if you give an army with this kind of capability and opportunity, they'll punch.
Mm-hmm.
And that fist is going to hit, and when it hits, it hurts.
Yeah.
And every once in a while, the Russians, because nobody's perfect, they make a mistake, they make an error, the Ukrainians take advantage of it, and Russians die. But right now, the Russians are slaughtering the Ukrainians on the battlefield overwhelmingly, and they're grinding them down. They're pushing them back. It's a slow, bloody, laborious process, but it has taken on an air of certainty, meaning that when you look at a battlefield, to give you an example, when we crossed over on Normandy on D-Day 1944 with our European allies, we initiated, a battle with the Germans on French soil, and it was touch and go there for a minute. It was tough. But when Patton broke out and began his big sweep, and they pushed the Germans out of France into the Benelux area, and we got right up to the German border, the war was over.
Mm-hmm.
Germany was not going to recover from that.
Right.
Now, there was still the Battle of the Bulge. There was still the Battle of the Hurtgen Forest. There were still the bloody battles that ensued that killed tens of thousands of American soldiers. The war wasn't over, meaning they surrendered. It just meant that the outcome was not going to be altered. The same thing after the Battle of Kursk in 1943, when the Soviets defeated the last major German offensive operation. It's July, August 1943. The war doesn't end until May 1945 when the Soviets take Berlin. But the war was over,
Right.
meaning that Germany was not going to recover from this. There was no games that could be played in terms of moving troops on a map and all this. Anybody looking at that went, we now know the Soviet Union is going to take Berlin. We now know in 1944 that the United States is going, and the British and the French and the Canadians are going to drive, and they're going to head towards Berlin, and that in between them are Germans who can't win.
Right.
We are at that point right now. The Ukrainians cannot win. They can't. It's over. It's all over but the shouting, the screaming, the dying. The Ukrainians apparently are going to continue to fight on. And they're being helped by the NATO, the West, the United States, who are providing them with tens of billions of dollars worth of modern equipment, which means that the fighting that is going to occur is going to be bloody. It's going to be violent. Russians are going to die. But Russia will not lose this fight. Russia cannot lose this fight unless there's an absolute loss of political will. And while I don't know Vladimir Putin personally, from what I've read about him, I don't think he's the kind of guy that wakes up in the morning and says, I made a mistake in Ukraine, I'm going to surrender today. I think he's committed to victory. I think the Russian people are committed to victory. The Russian military is committed to victory, and there will be a victory. It will take time. We have a hint on how much time. Denis Pushilin, the president of the Donetsk People's Republic, spoke at the St. Petersburg Economic Forum last week on Russian soil at a forum hosted by the Russian president. So one would assume that his words have been carefully considered. And he said that the special military operation will probably end sometime by the end of the year. So we have months of fighting ahead, but it's months of fighting where the Russians are in 100% control of what's going on the battlefield. And what's going on the battlefield is that the Ukrainians are dying at a prodigious rate. We're talking hundreds, in some cases, thousands of dead per day.
Wow.
Per day.
Wow. Wow. Well, you answered in that answer, you touched on a lot of different things that I had formatted as questions. So I think I'm gonna skip ahead a little bit here, Scott. Do you think NATO is going to lose the will to continue to, as you said, billions of dollars in? We know that Biden signed off, I think, on another billion not too long ago. And we still don't have a declaration of war from Congress, which to me, this seems like we're fighting a war, even though technically we don't have troops on the ground there, but we're certainly, I would say, engaged in a proxy war, if that's, where we're going. But quite honestly, do you think NATO is going to lose the will to continue to be almost like cheerleading and saying, yeah, things are going great. Kind of reminds me of the days of Baghdad Bob, hey, everything is, we're winning this, we're doing great. Because Western media, this is why I think you're a very important guest to have on the show, is that Western media, you don't hear a thing about what you just said. You don't hear, all you hear is, it's a tough battle, and it appears that, the Ukraine, they have this will, and they continue to fight, and Zelensky wants more help, and we're sending him more help. And meanwhile, Americans are paying $5 a gallon for gas, and Putin's being blamed for everything. It's really strange. I mean, it's almost as if the West and NATO has essentially said, we're willing to kind of sacrifice our own population. We're willing for people to suffer so we can continue what we're doing here. And to me, it's almost like a darker agenda here. And I don't know what that is, but it quite honestly, it doesn't make a lot of sense. If you say Russia is committed and they're going, to do this no matter how long it takes, essentially, hopefully it wraps up this year, because nobody likes war. At least I don't like war. I wish this didn't happen. I mean, my wish is that we'd stop going to war and we would negotiate. And obviously there was a window for negotiation. There was a window, and Russia, as you say, made it fairly clear what they wanted out of this. And everybody rejected it. Everybody said, no, we understand you think that there are Nazis here. And then the West basically laughed at that and said, no, that's not true. We've debunked that. And most of the people here in the United States kind of lapped that stuff up, and they have their little, Ukrainian flag icon or lapel pin or whatever it is. I drove by a house the other day that was flying a Ukrainian flag, and I'm sitting there going, this is just crazy. I mean, can you address the will here of NATO, and will they eventually? I mean, the Germans, right now are now firing up their coal plants again because they're worried about keeping warm, and that doesn't do a lot for climate change, Scott. I don't know if you're a big proponent of worrying about climate change, but if you were, per se, and this was your agenda now for the last 40 years, saying, we really need to take these coal plants offline. And now, because Russia, they had this relationship where, sure, we will sell you energy, but, it's that old adage of biting your nose off to spite your face. It's kind of what it seems like to me.
No, you're right. I guess we need to understand two things, or at least I need to explain two things in order for my answer to make sense. And that,
okay,
to understand, I'm not here to dictate to anybody. I'll give you my perception.
Right.
My perception is that NATO is an institution that takes on because it's existed for so long, it's assumed an independent character, a personality that might be different from the personalities of its constituent nations. Mm-hmm. So to give you an example, when an ambassador from Bulgaria goes into NATO headquarters, he now is in lockstep with NATO think, how NATO works. And NATO's become a self-licking ice cream cone, which means it exists only for itself. It doesn't exist to do anything else. It has no mission, it has no purpose, it has no viability. It exists to exist. Here we are, coming into, the summer months, and we tend to forget what was going on just a year ago today. Afghanistan was collapsing.
Yeah.
And by August, it had collapsed. NATO and the United States had suffered one of the greatest political and military defeats in modern history.
Yes.
A 20-year debacle, which was punctuated by this desperate airlift out of Kabul, which just embarrassed and humiliated the West. And NATO had been humiliated by the United States. abandoned by the United States, told you're on your own, get out on your own. We have our own plan, and NATO fled, and many NATO members were saying, well, who are we? What are we? What do we do?
Yeah.
And then, of course, Joe Biden said, trust me, I will reinvigorate us with a new enemy, because an organization like NATO has to have a focus. So the new focus became Russia, which was the old focus, but now is refocused.
Mm-hmm.
It is refocused through the lens of not just Ukraine, but Ukraine is interpreted by Poland, by the Czech Republic, by the Baltic states, by these 5 nations that were virulently anti-Russian to begin with.
Yeah.
And so they served to magnify the issue of Ukraine so that it became an existential crisis for NATO. It didn't need to be. NATO, but except that NATO needed a reason to exist now. And so now Russia became the reason, and Ukraine became an existential matter, not just for Russia, because everybody knew that if you carved Ukraine out of the Russian sphere, that this would strategically weaken Russia, but also for NATO having committed to this objective. So NATO has this strategic objective of survival. Remember, this is an institution that needs to survive.
Yeah.
France doesn't need NATO to survive. England doesn't need NATO to survive. No nation needs NATO to survive. NATO needs NATO to survive. That's it. That's all there is. This is an organization that long ago lost a viable reason to exist. It only exists to please itself. It is literally the self-licking ice cream cone that now decided that we're going to make an issue of Ukraine. But there are 30 members of NATO, and NATO is a consensus-driven organization, and you need all 30 members to agree. And here's the weakness of NATO, that while Joe Biden can come into NATO leadership and paint this picture of how NATO needs to confront Russia, be focused on Russia, Jens Stoltenberg, the Secretary General, can get up and give speech after speech after speech. At the end of the day, it comes down to what the constituent states want. And because it's a consensus organization, most states say, well, we will follow the lead, so to speak. But then this conflict took on, first of all, this was never supposed to be an armed conflict. I mean, not the way it is.
Right.
I think we learned something, though. We learned something very interesting from the words of Poroshenko, Peter Poroshenko, the former president of Ukraine. Poroshenko came out last week and said the Minsk II Accords, 2015, a framework for peace, an agreement that had been negotiated by the so-called Normandy format. That's Germany, France, Ukraine, and Russia as an observer. The idea of the Minsk Accords was that Ukraine would undertake certain legal changes that preserved the cultural, ethnic, and linguistic rights of the Russian population of the Donbass, which there was a struggle on since 2014.
Yeah.
In return, Donbass would remain part of Ukraine because the Donbass had tried to declare independence prior to this. And so this was negotiated, but then we ran into the spectacle from 2015 until literally 2022. Ukraine never acted on this. And the Ukrainians always said, well, it's very difficult for us politically. I mean, and we know that. We know Poroshenko was told that if he signed Minsk, he was going to die. Zelensky was told the same thing. If you sign Minsk, you die. This was by the Nazis, the ones that don't exist. They're the ones, the non-existent Nazis are threatening to kill the presidents of an ostensibly sovereign democratic nation if they enter into an agreement that had been negotiated with other powers. And this was the narrative that was playing along.
Yeah.
But Poroshenko stripped that away. He said, we never intended to implement Minsk. Minsk was only a vehicle to buy time so that we could militarize, that is, build up a military capable of being a military trained by NATO equipped by NATO, capable of taking the Donbass back and maybe Crimea.
Mhm.
Now, the interesting thing about that is that it appears that Poroshenko's narrative is the narrative that Germany and France were operating on also, and the United States, meaning NATO. NATO was operating under this. NATO was using the Minsk Accords as a vehicle to buy time while NATO trained the Ukrainian army so that the Ukrainian army, acting as a proxy of NATO, could launch an offensive operation against the Donbass, occupy it, and then push Russia out of Crimea. This was the NATO plan all along. To use the Ukrainian military as a proxy army to attack Russia, so that Ukraine could be seized away from the Russian orbit once and for all. This is why, when this war, the special military operation started, and Vladimir Putin and his generals were saying, we have no choice but to attack now because the Ukrainians have amassed this massive force that are going to attack in the next couple of days or weeks, the Donbass. So we have to preempt their attack. That's why they cited Article 51, peremptory collective self-defense, authorized, under the United Nations Charter. Everybody went, oh, you're just making that up. That's just the Russians playing a legal game. No, it's real. It's real.
Yeah.
Ukraine had massed around 100,000 troops, trained by NATO, equipped by NATO, led by officers operating under instruction from NATO, who were ready to attack the Donbass sometime in early March. So
Right.
That's the reality of the situation. So NATO was always going to go to war against Russia, but not as NATO, using the Ukrainian army.
Yeah.
Now, the way they were going to pressure the Russians not to interfere with this was through economic means. I mean, we know this because Joe Biden met with Vladimir Putin in June of 2021 in Geneva, Switzerland, where he supposedly sat down and stared Putin in the eyes, his steely-eyed Joe Biden stare. And he said, if you attack Ukraine, we will hit you with the most stringent economic sanctions ever. Your country will collapse. Your economy will fail. It'll be awful for you. You can't even think about this. And Putin went, spasiba. And he went back and he told his guys, yeah, they're going to hit us with everything they got economically. What are we going to do? And they spent the next couple months preparing a plan so that when, and the thing about NATO and Europe, they bought into the American plan. They bought into the premise that even if Russia does attack Ukraine, it can't sustain this attack because we're going to hit Russia with everything we got economically, and their economy is going to collapse. You remember, I'm going to make rubble out of the ruble.
Yes.
Biden's fantastic.
Catchy, very catchy phrase. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's wonderful. And everybody chuckles, he's going to make rubble out of the ruble. Yeah. And then, on and on and on. The idea was the economy would collapse, the Russian people would rise up, would out, and victory to the Ukraine, Slava Ukraina. There's a problem, though, and it's called Russia. The Russians are smarter and better at doing this kind of stuff than we are. They're more focused. They're serious actors. And when they were ready for the sanctions, and I don't need to get long story short, all we have to do is say the sanctions boomerang. It's not the Russian economy that's collapsing right now.
No.
It's the European economy.
Correct.
It's the American economy.
Yeah.
The ruble isn't rubble. The ruble's stronger than it has been in some time now, and it's going to get stronger. Russia's relations with the world are stronger than before. Not with the West. They've never been strong with the West. Not with the United States. Russia doesn't care. They've divorced from us. They're now focused eastwards towards China, an alliance that's better than any alliance in the world, we're told, and apparently it is.
Yeah.
They have strong relationships with India, with the rest of the world. They're selling their oil. For an economy that's supposed to be collapsing, they had a $100 billion surplus last quarter. They're going to have a $150 billion surplus. I think Joe Biden would die for a surplus. Like he'd die for a surplus of $1. We're running a deficit economy that's it's on the verge of collapse right now. But this is a long way of setting up to your answer. Can NATO survive this? NATO as an institution is a byproduct of the political will of constituent members. They're going to have a meeting in the end of June this month. in Madrid. It's an interesting meeting
Yeah.
because, let's talk about Germany for a second. Germany, who is going to not only spend 100 billion euro to revitalize their military, which any historian would say probably the dumbest idea in history, to allow the Germans
Yeah.
to create a massive military tied to an expansionist foreign policy. Not a good idea. Been there, done that. We got a couple T-shirts in the basement. We might want to pull them out and look at them. It's just stupid. But
right,
100 billion euro from what? What economy is going to generate this 100 billion euro? Because in addition to this, you brought up something interesting. The European community got together and they just had, I think last month, this wonderful meeting that they always have. They say, we're going to take advantage of this opportunity provided by the Russians, the divorce from Russian energy, and we're going to revitalize our commitment to green. We're going to commit 210 billion euro for a new energy strategy that'll free us from Russian energy by 2024. And because we're Europeans and we're so well-meaning, we're going to have renewables just jump up and expand. And we're well on the way to the green economy that we always wanted. Thank you, Russia, Slava Ukraina. It didn't work. It's not working.
No.
Germany right now is in a gas emergency.
Yeah.
The German government has announced the alarm phase of the gas emergency. They're rationing energy. Their industries are going to shut down. And God bless the renewables, but they don't generate squat.
Yes,
and they
thank
can't
you.
generate squat. You can't build a green economy on anything other than a fully functioning carbon economy. You need a carbon economy that's working on all cylinders, that has enough buffer that you can then begin to replace. But everything's got to be functioning. The carbon economy is collapsing in Germany right now. They've got to bring more carbon in. They've got to fire up the coal plants. They don't have any nuclear plants to fire up because they shut them down. The Germans are going down for the count. I mean, this is literally Ollie's fist has hit Fraser, and Fraser is stumbling, and Howard Cosell is saying, Fraser's going down, because they're going down. The French are going down. Everybody's going down for the count. They ain't getting up. This isn't Rocky. Rocky's not coming back up and going to launch the punch. Ivan Drago has punched him and knocked him out. This is Apollo Creed going down. This ain't Rocky. It's the death punch. This is the reality that we're in right now. And so NATO now is going to sit there and try and have these plans, such as they want to spend tens of billions of dollars injecting new military capacity to the East.
Yeah.
Who's going to pay for that? The United States is not going to pay for that. The general, I forget his name now, Wolford, I think, the commander of European forces, testified to Congress a little while ago, a couple months ago, and he was talking about the future and such. And they said, well, why aren't we sending troops there now? He said, well, we're going to wait till the Ukrainian thing is calmed down. And they said, well, why? He said, well, because we need a host nation. And while a lot of nations claim they want to have American troops, you got to understand that you got to pay for that.
Yeah.
That we're not paying for. That if you want an American division on Polish soil, the Polish government is going to have to front up the tens of billions of dollars necessary to build the infrastructure that brings them in. And then they're going to have to sustain that payment because the American taxpayer isn't going to underwrite the cost of putting American troops in Europe anymore. And they're going to have to sign status of forces agreements that are pretty tough for most sovereign nations to want to sign, such as you don't get to prosecute American soldiers when they do stupid things like rape your women. And that's an extreme one. Maybe they'd make an exception for that, but not really. I mean, we put status of forces agreement that make American troops virtually untouchable by the host nation. So nobody's willing to do that right now, to have that conversation. So we have troops in Poland, but they're there temporarily. The 82nd Airborne Division, I think we have an armor brigade floating around there somewhere, a striker brigade, but they're not there permanently. At some point, they'll have to be withdrawn. But so NATO's going to have this conversation about restructuring. all these nations are going to be asked to invest more money, more money, more money. Well, how do you invest more money when your economy is literally collapsing?
Right.
And here's
Right.
the thing about collapsing economies. And I'll leave it at this because I know you told me to go off on tangents, and I follow instructions like a good Marine. But you know, James Carville famously told Bill Clinton back in the early 1990s when Clinton was making his initial run at the presidency, and Clinton was going to talk about Balkans, he was going to talk about foreign policy, and he was going to talk about, this, that, and the other thing. And Carville wisely slapped him across the face, figuratively, and
Yeah.
said, "It's the economy, stupid.
Stupid.
That's
Yeah.
all you need to focus on." The
Right.
incumbent president, who is very difficult to beat under any circumstance, made an utterance. "Read my lips, no new taxes."
Taxes.
His
Yeah.
lips moved, there were new taxes. It's
Right.
the economy. Focus on the economy, and you will win the presidency. And he did.
Yeah.
Right now, Europe isn't going to play the we're going to spend billions to go to war against Russia routine.
Yeah.
Europe right now is in survival mode. It's
Yeah.
the economy, stupid. And
Right.
Europe is the last time I checked, there weren't any true dictators left in Europe. We have a couple in Hungary that might think they're dictators, but ultimately they serve at the will of the people.
Yeah.
And the will of the people, let's look at America right now, the United States, the wonderful country that I call home. And it is a wonderful country. I'm frustrated by it sometimes.
Yes.
But
sometimes.
we've had some horrible things unfold on television that everybody saw, the shootings, mass shootings. So gun control is a big hot ticket topic.
Yes.
Well, there's a tongue twister, but
easy for you to say, right?
yeah, and pretty soon the Supreme Court's going to release its decision on the rethinking of Roe versus Wade abortion. That's always been a very tough topic for the United States. So abortion and gun control are sweeping across the thing. But what's the thing that all Americans are worried about more than any of that? Because gun control and abortion are only ticking up in single digits when you talk about the big thing.
Yeah.
The thing Americans are worried about is the economy.
Yep.
It's the fact that back in January, it took me $30 to fill up my gas tank. Today it cost me $65, and that number is only going up. It's the fact that everything costs more. And I'm not receiving more money in my paycheck, but life is costing me 20%, 25% more, which means that I can do less. Americans aren't happy about that. No one's happy about it, but we have it so much better than the Europeans. The Europeans are literally going to return to the Stone Age by the time winter rolls around. So,
yeah,
I mean, they'll be burning wood stoves to stay warm. So, NATO doesn't have the will, because NATO as an institution thinks it has the will. Remember, they're the self-licking ice cream cone. They're just going to say, "Oh, we taste good, we taste good, we taste good." But the people holding it are looking at a melting ice cream cone, their hands getting dirty, and they're not, and they're just like, "I don't want this anymore. I need to focus on myself and the people." And so the leaders that have bought into these policies, this failed economic war against Russia, this failed war against Russia and Ukraine, using Ukraine as a proxy, these are political leaders who are ultimately held accountable to their respective constituents. And the vast majority of these political leaders come from parliamentarian type systems. We're in the United States, we have Joe Biden, for better or worse, until he either dies, gets impeached, or is up for election in 2024. Ain't nothing going to change that in between. A parliamentary leader can be eliminated right now, today. And we just saw that in Bulgaria, where the parliament had a vote of no confidence, tossing out the pro-NATO, pro-EU, pro-US prime minister, and they're going to put somebody new in. And I bet you that somebody new is going to be more focused on figuring out how the hell do we get Russian gas back into Bulgaria before it's winter and we all freeze to death. That'll be his number one priority, not defending pipe dreams that coming out of Brussels about some grand NATO strategy to contain, control, and manipulate Russia using multiple levers of power and influence that cost money that we don't have. So I think this summer and this fall is going to be time of political transition and transformation in Europe. We saw this in France. Macron won the presidential election, but he got crushed at the parliamentarian level, and now he has a far left prime minister, and you're going to see France become paralyzed politically. And it's going to be, so France is not going to be the leader that people want, even if France ever led the way that people want, because it's a very contrarian country. Germany, can Schultz survive the summer? Can his parliamentarian majority hold when everything is collapsing? Everything right now. When the industry shut down and they don't reopen, and the socialist state no longer has money available to pay the salaries of all the unemployed Germans, you really think the Germans are going to be marching in the street saying, "We want NATO, we want NATO"? I think you're going to be saying the exact opposite.
Right.
The British Prime Minister just suffered a recall election. He won narrowly, and it wasn't because of this issue. It's because he's a moron who parties during COVID. But when the British economy collapses, Finland and Sweden are both sitting there saying, we want to join NATO. We want to join NATO. When your economies collapse, suddenly NATO is not going to be as attractive as everybody thinks it is. I honestly believe that this coming NATO summit, when studied by historians, is going to be one of those seminal moments where they said, it's like when people look at the fall of the Roman Empire, it's very difficult for people to say, that's when the Roman Empire fell. No, I think that's when the Roman Empire fell. I think this coming NATO summit is going to be one of those moments where historians down the road go, that's when NATO fell right there. Now, that means NATO could last for decades.
Sure.
But NATO will never recover from this. NATO can never recover from this. It's over.
Yeah. Wow. Great analysis, Scott. You were on another show, and I tend to watch. I follow you on Telegram, so I tend to watch.
Shame on you.
Sorry, I tend to watch all the videos that you upload, and there was one video that you were talking about. I hope that we get through this year.
Oh yeah.
So I can get to next year, and you were dead serious. You were more serious than a heart attack, and I think we're going to close on this, because if you go into detail here, I think we're probably going to be on here for a couple of hours talking. But you had me really worried, and I'm sitting here going, are we not taking the threat seriously? Are we not? We're kind of just going along, and we're thinking, yeah, we'll just keep poking the bear. And then you got this thing in Lithuania right now, which is another, we could have gone down that road, right? You're shaking your head because you know what I'm talking about. Yeah, it's like, why are they doing this? Do they think that the Russians, that, like you said earlier, the Russia is a serious country. They're serious people. They're not just, hey, we'll play this foreign policy game with everybody else, and, eventually we'll back away and we'll, but tell us, Scott, what you were talking about in that video. And obviously, you don't have to provide all the context, but I think what you were referring to is, I don't know, nuclear winter, maybe? I don't know.
Well, I'm talking about nuclear war.
Okay.
There's a lot of speculation going on about, could this Ukrainian conflict create the conditions for nuclear war between NATO and Russia, the United States and Russia? And a lot of the spin that's being placed on this is that Russia, their back is against the wall. They will have no other option but to use nuclear weapons to win the war. No, Russia's winning conventionally. They're not going to lose.
Right.
It's not Russia that can start a nuclear conflict. It's the United States.
Yeah.
And we start by the premise that earlier this year, the five major nuclear powers, Russia, the United States, China, France, and Great Britain, all got together, and they breathed life into a Reagan era, President Ronald Reagan statement and concept that he had with Mikhail Gorbachev, the last president of the only president of the Soviet Union, the last leader of the Soviet Union, where they said nuclear war can never be won, therefore it must never be fought. And this was a bedrock principle of that time. That sort of is what led rise to some of the greatest arms control treaties in the history of arms control, the INF Treaty, START Treaty. But somehow, with the collapse of the Soviet Union and then our rape of Russia for the decade of the 1990s, where we treated them like a weak, defeated enemy instead of a friend who needed help, we came away with this notion that we are the sole remaining superpower, and our goal and objective must be to retain American nuclear primacy, and we keep everybody else down while we keep ourselves up. So arms control went out the window. This is why George W. Bush didn't want to even talk about arms control. SORT treaty that he negotiated was just sort of this ridiculous thin document that had no verification. Any real arms control specialist viewed it as what it is, a joke. And this leads then for people, because once you start to invest money in nuclear weapons and reconstruct your posture and how you're going to, suddenly we're led to believe that maybe we could win a nuclear war. And what I mean by that is, I always laugh at the statement that, I laugh because, it's like laughing in a firing squad. Hey, you guys are going to shoot me. All right, man. Hey,
good news. All right. Yeah.
Jimmy Franco did a movie where he was getting hung, and he sort of laughed at the end. Oh, first time, huh? Because it's a short movie. People can Google it. But it's the point is, you laugh sometimes at the most absurd situations. And so I'm laughing about nuclear annihilation because of the ludicrous concept of the United States signing on to a statement this year, February this year, when we did it, that says nuclear war cannot be won, therefore it should not be fought. And yet, as recently as 2019, then Secretary of Defense Mark Esper, under Trump, brought into the American arsenal a weapon called the W-76-2, which is a low-yield nuclear warhead mounted on the Trident missile on Trident submarines. And the sole purpose of this warhead, this low-yield warhead, which is, I think, 1/5 the size of the bomb dropped on Hiroshima, so 5 kilotons instead of 20. That's 1/4. Anyways, Marine math, work with me. The point is that it's a low-yield weapon that was designed to give the President of the United States options when it came to nuclear war, so that we could fight and win a nuclear war.
Oh,
that's the official American policy. Biden said he was going to change it. He didn't change it. He actually has embraced it, incorporated. It is the policy of the Biden administration that the President of the United States has a range of options when it comes to the employment of nuclear weapons that allows us in certain conditions to fight and win a nuclear war. One of these conditions, which Esper's war gamed, was a Russian military incursion into where? The Baltics, of all places, maybe Lithuania, where the Russians were overwhelming the Lithuanian NATO forces. So we fired a single W-76-2 low-yield nuclear weapon, bam, hit the Russians and said, there, stop, guys. Except the people that did that didn't listen to Vladimir Putin when he spoke on numerous occasions. Once at the Valdai conference in Sochi, where he said, Russia will never start a nuclear war. But if you hit us with a nuclear weapon, then we all die.
Right.
You will be criminals. We will be martyrs. Meaning, you started this. We know we're going to die, but we're taking everybody with us. Right. There is no such thing as a limited nuclear war. Right. No such thing at all. So the danger in Europe is the United States thinking, first of all, the United States provoking Russia into a situation where Russia stops a self-limited special military operation and transitions into general war.
Yeah.
For instance, if we provoke them in Transnistria, over Moldova, over that enclave of nearly 500,000 Russians and people sympathetic to the Russian Federation, this breakaway republic. If we provoke them by having Polish troops go into Ukraine, the Ukrainian government is negotiating with the Polish government right now. They say by August, the Poles might actually deploy troops into Ukraine. Wow. And then Lithuania instituting a blockade against the the Russian enclave of Kaliningrad, which they're now talking about escalating to cut off energy, they cut the pipeline. The Russians have come out and said there will not be a diplomatic solution to this crisis. The Russian response is going to be practical. Well, okay, there you go. I wonder how practical a fist to the face sounds, because that's about what's about to happen. So we have this scenario where NATO is just seeking to provoke Russia on a number of fronts, and none of which they can win in. Lithuania has to know that if Russia unleashed its forces against them, that it would be over in 6 days.
Yeah.
NATO has been worried about this place called the Solwecki Gap. It's basically a narrow slight. You have the Kaliningrad enclave here, then you have Belarus, which Russian troops are stationed on there. And between Belarus and the Kaliningrad Gap, you have the Polish and the Lithuanian borders come together. And that gap between the two is called the Solwecki Gap. And NATO is always worried that Russia would launch an offensive through the Solwecki Gap, splitting Poland off from the Baltics, meaning that it would now physically isolate the Baltics. I always thought that whoever came up with that idea was smoking dope, because the Russians would never do that. Except when Lithuania decides that they're going to violate all their treaty obligations and institute a blockade of Kaliningrad, which is an act of war, an act of insanity. So that's where we are. But this is about tickling the Russian bear. And you never tickle the Russian bear, because as somebody once famously said, I have a million ways to get the Russian bear out of the cave. I don't have any way to get him back in the cave. So we're getting ready to bring the Russian bear out of the cave. But that's not the one that scares me. That's not the one that makes me lose sleep at night, because I still believe that the United States and NATO understand the consequences of their actions. The one that scares me is China, Taiwan. That's the one that I lose sleep on, because I believe that the United States has crossed the threshold. We have broken every red line the Chinese have put out about Taiwan. The Taiwanese government is now believing that it could be independent, and that it has the back of the United States has its back in a military confrontation, so that it can initiate independence activities. The United States will back it up, and China won't be able to do anything about it. And China said, you're high, we're coming in with everything, we're going to destroy you, we're going to smash you to smithereens. The Chinese are saying statements at the defense level which they have never said before in their history. Where he just met with Lloyd Austin, his American counterpart, and said, we will sink your fleet. Bring it on, baby. Bring it on. Jake Sullivan's receiving phone calls from his counterpart telling him to shut up. Literally, I mean, Chinese officials calling the National Security Advisor of the United States saying, shut up. Every time you open your mouth, you say something stupid, and there's going to be a war. The Chinese ambassador to the United States had an interview with NPR where he said, if the United States continues to behave the way it does with Taiwan, we will be at war with you. Okay. Do you think the Chinese bluff?
No.
One of the most mature nations in terms of their thinking. They've always been very reticent, very close-held. So when you have senior Chinese officials saying, hey, dude, we're about to go to war and it's going to be ugly. Maybe you might want to listen. And here's the thing. There's nothing the United States can do to stop China from taking Taiwan if China wants to take Taiwan. But we will try. We will send our fleet. That fleet has an aircraft carrier, a couple of them. They have 6,000 Americans on each aircraft carrier. They will be sunk. 100% guarantee, sunk. What does America do when we lose 12, 14, 15,000 sailors like that? All the ships down at the bottom of the sea, all dead. Do we sit there and go, oh, okay? Or do we say, we need to send a message to China that you cannot do this? So we're going to send a nuclear weapon against, and they'll pick, I think, some sort of little pathetic port city in the island of Hunan because it's limited. It won't kill. China won't really mind losing that naval facility there. So boom, we hit them with a nuke. Maybe it's a W-76-2 low yield nuke. Wow, because that gives the president options. You think the Chinese are going to say, oh, you nuked us. Okay. Or do you think China will go, no, they won't say Desvidani. Where the Chinese word is for bye-bye San Francisco, bye-bye Seattle, bye-bye Denver. And now we lose Los Angeles. Now we lose a major San Diego. I wouldn't do that because that would get Mexico. Probably won't get Seattle because that would get Canada. The Chinese are very conscientious, unlike us. But they'll hit something that is purely America as retaliation. And then you think the American president can look at the American people and say, don't worry, we lost Denver. The 6 million people that were there, they're all dead. That's okay, because we're going to call it quits. No, he's going to say immediate retaliation.
Right.
And now they begin this process. And this is the one. And I think China is going to take Taiwan sometime this fall because America's so stupid. We don't know how to shut up. We don't know how to stop doing what we're doing. And once this war starts, we don't know how to say, oops, we're just going to let the Taiwanese on their own. That would be the smart move. We're going to send the fleet. And when we send the fleet, we lose the fleet. When we lose the fleet, I don't think the United States is mature enough as a nation to suffer the loss of a fleet, not do anything in retaliation.
Yeah.
That's the one that makes me lose sleep. That's why I worry about going into the next year. China, the dragon.
Right.
I think we're smart enough to know the bear is going to eat us.
Yeah.
Nobody's paying attention to the dragon. And it's the dragon that's going to burn us.
Wow. All right, Scott. On that note, but I did want to get your perspective on that because it is a very compelling issue, and I think, like you say, a lot of people aren't really paying attention. We've really not, as a country, the media in general, not really paying enough attention to foreign policy, and when they do, they kind of miss the point most of the time. And that's another one of the reasons why I wanted to have you on today to talk about this stuff. And I appreciate you so much. Before you go, I hear you've got a book coming out, or was this a book that had already come out?
It literally just was published. It's available right now on the way books work. I don't want to get into the book business, but you can do a print on demand right now, meaning that the book has been loaded into this massive machine somewhere. Mm-hmm. And if you order the book, then the order goes through this machine. The machine prints the book and ships it. So you can get the book now. It's the same book that you would buy in the store. The printing, the mass printing of the hard copy of books that go to stores and stuff like that isn't going to happen until, I think, once you get in the queue, who knows? They say November. Some people are telling me it'd be September. Mm-hmm. So Amazon, for instance, if you go to Amazon.com and order the book, you're going to have to wait until the book is released to Amazon warehouses, either in September, October, November. If you go to Clarity Press, which is the publisher, you can order the book from there, and it's print on demand. So you order the book, and a copy will be printed and shipped. I just had 4 print-on-demand books delivered to me, and they look just like the books that you get normally. Look, I'm very proud of this book. This is my 10th book, so it's I'm proud of all the books I write, but this one is, I think, whatever the formula is for capturing history, biography, and a compelling message, and making it entertaining. I think I captured that formula here. When you write about nuclear war, nuclear weapons, like I did with my previous book, Scorpion King, good book, but man, people get depressed, I guess, reading something like that. But this is actually a book about the implementation of the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty. One of a story that should be known by every American, everybody in the world, but nobody talks about it because nobody knows about it, because nothing's ever been written about it. Right. How it has. And it's also about perestroika. It's called Disarmament in the Time of Perestroika. And it's just a unique story of how Americans and Soviets collaborated to build one of the most technologically advanced arms control monitoring facilities outside of a Soviet ICBM factory. Mm-hmm. And then doing this while the Soviet Union is undergoing the torture of perestroika and a collapsed economy, eventually leading to the end of the Soviet Union. The period from 1988 to 1991 is captured by this book. And I think it has important lessons because people today are like, how can we get out of the mess that we're in? Mm-hmm. So read this book because, in 1986, we were in a similar mess. Yeah. We were locked in this death struggle with the Soviet Union. And there was real fear of nuclear war in Europe. And the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty ended that. We got rid of nuclear weapons. And it wasn't easy. It was hard work. Right. It took a lot of innovation, et cetera, sacrifice. And this is a book about that hard work, that sacrifice, and the result, the elimination of entire classes of nuclear weapons. So read the book. Maybe maybe read the book instead of thinking about tickling the dragon, because this book I think will actually give people hope.
Yeah.
And today we do need hope. So Disarmament: The Time of Perestroika, new book out. Clarity Press is the publisher.
All right, there you have it. And Scott, are you still on Twitter, or did you get kicked off permanently?
Oh, I'm permanently. They remind me every time I try to log in. I have been permanently banned from Twitter. So no, I think those days are done. I'm on Telegram right now.
All right.
Just Scott Ritter. So although I understand there's a lot of fake Scott Ritters out there, so I don't know how you differentiate between the real one and the fake one. But it's just Scott Ritter on Telegram. It's got my ugly face with a Oakley hat, Oakley sunglasses, and I'm smiling. So, that's about the only social media I'm on right now. I guess I'm, at some point in time, I'll figure out how to do the other stuff if needed. But right now, I actually enjoy, going on shows like yours. I enjoy being a tool that other people can use to get a message across, as opposed to, trying to self-promote myself is something I'm just here for people to use. And the beauty of that is it's a self-limiting feature, meaning that when people don't want to talk to me, I get to do whatever I want. Go play with my dogs, go play golf, go do something. I'm not trapped in perpetuating, the image of Scott Ritter.
Yeah. Well, Scott, we thank you for coming on here. And again, it's been a pleasure. A lot of great information here. Again, I would tell people to follow Scott on Twitter, because he tends to post most of the videos that he appears in. So you can find that information over there, which that's one of the reasons, Scott, you were doing videos, and you were on with, I think it was Judge Napolitano recently, and he's been doing some great work over on his YouTube channel. But there's a few independent guys like me who are out there who are just trying to, get to the truth and get an alternative perspective from what you're hearing in the so-called mainstream media each day. So again, Scott, thanks for coming on.
Well, thanks for having me, and thanks for doing what you're doing.
All right.